Now, to use this custom header component, we could go to the index.html file, where we're also using this app root component, so the app component, and there we could add app-header, opening and closing like this. If you would save this, though, you would see no difference on the screen. There you would not see that new header component markup that we set up. It's nowhere to be found here. Also not if we inspect this page here and the rendered elements. There indeed we would see app header, but it would be an empty HTML element that doesn't do anything, because the browser doesn't recognize it and Angular actually ignores it. Because what's important to understand as an Angular developer is that Angular is not automatically scanning all your files and folders and looking for components you might be defining. Instead, you have to explicitly tell Angular if you have a new component and you want to use it somewhere. And that's, for example, what's happening in the main.ts file with help of that bootstrap application function. This function tells Angular that there is an app component and that it should look for this component's tag in the index.html file to display the content of this component on the screen. Therefore, what we could of course do is also call bootstrap application and pass our header component to it. We would simply import header component, our class, from this header component TypeScript file without the extension, as you learned, and pass it to another bootstrap application call. If you would do that and you save everything, you would indeed see that now the headers component is visible on the screen. So now Angular is aware of it and finds its tag and renders its content. However, this is typically not how you would render this component, because the idea with Angular in the end is that you build a tree of components where you have one component, the root component, typically the app component, at the top, and then you have other components nested inside of that component or nested inside of other components. And this is not just some arbitrary design decision made by the Angular team. Instead, the idea behind building such a component tree is that those components that are part of the same tree, part of the same Angular application, therefore, will be able to work together and exchange data, for example, and communicate with each other, something you'll learn about in depth throughout this course. And therefore, the idea is that you typically only call bootstrap application once with that one main root component, and then you use any other components in that component's template or in templates of other nested components. So we would use our header component here instead of the template of the app component. That's the idea. For example, we could replace this dummy header here of that starting page I prepared for you with our app-header custom component tag, because that is the tag we're looking for because of this selector, app-header. That's what I'm now using here as an element in the app component's HTML file. However, if you add this here, you'll see that now you'll get an error if you take a look at this terminal where you started the development server by running npm start. You see that there you get an error that app-header is not a known element. And again, the reason for that is that Angular doesn't scan all your files and folders and automatically register components. Instead, as mentioned, you have to inform Angular about any components you created. And you do that when using a component inside of another component's template, as we're doing it here, by going to the component in which template you are using another component. So in this case, the app component, because it's the template of the app component in which we are using another component. And you then register that other component you want to use in this component's template. And that's done by importing that other component, so in this case the header component, from this component's file, so header.component without the file extension. And then you add it to this imports property, which you also find on this app component's configuration object. Because this configuration in the end works together with this standalone feature such that it registers all the things, all the standalone components, for example, that you want to use in the template of this app component. So you simply pass header component like this to this imports array. And that now unlocks this component for the template of this app component. And therefore, with this done, if you now save this and you have this development server up and running, it should automatically reload and re-execute your code. Now the error should be gone and you should now see that content on the screen, but now it's loaded in the way you typically would load and render other components, by adding them to your component tree. So we can now see the content of our header component on the screen, but of course it doesn't really look the way I want it to look yet. And we can change this by adding some styles, which is typically done by adding a new file, a header.component.css file in this case, again using that same naming pattern, and by then linking to that style file inside of the header component TypeScript file, by setting up the style URL configuration property here, which, just like template URL, wants a relative path to that style file. So in this case, to header.component.css. By the way, there also is a style URLs property you can set, which would take an array of multiple external style files that should be considered. And there also is just a styles property, which you could also set, which wants an array of inline styles where you define the CSS styles right inside of this TypeScript file. So that you could set up your CSS rules like this right inside of this file. That would work, but just as with inline templates, it's actually a discouraged pattern, and the most common way of linking to external files is therefore with style URLs, or if it's just a single file, with style URL, like this. Now, since this is not a CSS course, we won't write the style code together though, but instead attached you find a link to a header component.css file, which I prepared in advance, which you can simply copy into your project. Or you can copy the styles defined in that file into your header component CSS file. And attached you actually also find some other assets and files. For example, a task management logo PNG file, which you should copy and paste into your assets folder, because we'll soon use this image in our header markup. And you also find an updated styles.css file, which you should use to replace your styles.css file, which you find directly in the SRC folder. This style file sets up some global styles that will apply to all components, whereas the component-specific style files set up styles that apply only to the components they belong to, so they can't clash with styles of other components. We also need some global styles though, and that's why you find an updated styles.css file attached, and you can simply replace yours with the attached one. Now, this attached file also uses some special fonts, which we can import from Google Fonts, and therefore you should also go to the index.html file, and you should replace this file with the index.html file you find attached to simply add those extra links here which import fonts from Google Fonts. That's the only change I made with that index.html file. Well, and with all that done, we now improved the styling, and therefore, as a last step, you should go to the header component HTML file to also update the markup. Because in there, I now also want to output an image, which we can do with the default image element, and set the source to assets/task-management-logo.png. So to that file you find attached to this lecture, this task management logo PNG file. It's in the assets folder, so that's also the path we set up here. And Angular will then make sure that it gets loaded onto the page correctly. We can also set up some alt text here, like a to-do list, because that is what can be seen on that image. Now, when loading an image from the assets file like we're doing it here, there is one important thing you should check, and that's in that Angular JSON file in your root project folder. In there, you should make sure that you have this assets configuration, which should be an array, and that there you have this src/assets entry. If it instead looks something like this, where you don't have that assets entry, but where instead you might have a configuration object like this, you should make sure that you simply add that src/assets string to that array, just like this. Otherwise, the image can't be loaded. You should also make sure that you add this path to the fav icon here so that you see that as well. If you're using the started project I provided at the beginning of this section, that will already be the case though, and you don't need to make any changes to that Angular JSON file. And then for styling purposes, I want to wrap this h1 element into a div element and add a paragraph where I'll say enterprise level task management without friction. Of course, you can use any text you want. And with all these changes made, with that development server up and running, they will be picked up automatically, and you should now see this header on the screen if you reload the application. And that's therefore a huge step forward, because that's now our finished first custom component, the header component.